I didn't call the federal government because I wanted revenge. I called them because my neighbor decided a rusty pipe was trash, and I knew it wasn't. 3 days later, he was jackhammering $10,000 of concrete out of his own backyard while a sheriff stood there watching him. And that was just the beginning. The property I live on isn't anything fancy. It's not one of those magazine homes with perfect hedges and matching mailboxes. It's just land that's been in my family since the late 1940s, passed down from my grandfather to my dad, then to me. And if you've ever inherited something like that, you know it comes with a kind of quiet responsibility, like you're not just living there. You're taking care of something that existed long before you did. Back when I was a kid, my dad used to walk me along the edges of the property, not in a strict, lecture kind of way, more like a casual Saturday morning thing. Coffee in his hand, me kicking rocks, and every now and then he'd point things out. Old fence posts, a dip in the land where water used to run, and one day he stopped near the back corner and tapped this little concrete stub sticking out of the ground. It didn't look like much, maybe a few inches wide, weathered, cracked, with this dull brass cap on top and a rusted iron pipe coming out of it like something left behind and forgotten. I remember asking him why we didn't just pull it out, clean things up a bit, and he gave me this look, not angry, just serious, the kind that makes you remember what comes next. He said, "You don't touch that. Ever." Then he explained, in that slow, patient way he had, that it was a survey marker, not just any marker, but one tied into a federal system, something used by surveyors and engineers, and people who map out entire counties. He said it was like a fixed point in the world, something everything else gets measured from, and if you move it, even a little, you don't just mess up your own land, you mess up the map itself. At the time, I didn't fully get it. I just knew it mattered. Years later, after my dad passed, and the property became mine, that little marker was still there, right on the boundary line, half hidden by weeds most of the time, catching the sun just enough that you'd notice it if you knew to look, and I always did. It became one of those quiet things you check on without thinking, like making sure a door is locked or a light is off. Now, about a year ago, the house next door sold. It had been empty for a while, kind of run down, nothing dramatic, just neglected in that slow, sad way homes get when nobody's really paying attention anymore. And then one day a truck showed up, then another, and within a week there were crews going in and out, materials stacked in the driveway, dumpsters filling up. You could tell right away this wasn't someone moving in, this was someone flipping. The guy who bought it introduced himself about 2 days in, came over while I was out front messing with the hose, stuck his hand out like we were closing a deal. "Name's Kyle Mercer," he said, smiling like he'd practiced it. "I fix places up, make him nice again." I shook his hand, told him my name, welcomed him to the neighborhood, all that normal stuff. And for a while, everything was fine. Noisy, sure, but that's expected with construction, and honestly, it was nice seeing the place come back to life. Fresh paint, new windows, landscaping. He knew what he was doing. But then, about 3 weeks in, he started spending more time in the backyard. I noticed because that part of his yard lines up with the back corner of mine, the exact spot where that survey marker sits. At first, it was just measuring, pacing things out, talking on the phone, nothing unusual. But then one afternoon he called over to me while I was clearing some brush. "Hey," he said, pointing toward that corner. "What's that metal thing back there?" And just like that, I felt this little shift in my chest. Not panic, not yet, just awareness, like hearing a glass wobble on the edge of a table. I walked over, leaned on the fence, looked where he was pointing even though I already knew. "That's a survey marker," I told him, keeping it casual. "Federal one, you don't mess with it." He squinted at it, tilted his head a little, then laughed, not in a mean way exactly, but dismissive, like I'd just told him an old superstition. "Looks like junk," he said. "I'm thinking of putting a gazebo back there. Tuscan style, real nice, would clean this whole view up." I remember pausing for a second before I answered, choosing my words carefully because I could already tell what kind of conversation this might turn into. "Kyle," I said, "I'm serious. That thing isn't just decoration. It's protected, like legally. You move it, you're gonna have problems." He waved a hand like he was brushing off dust. "Come on," he said, "nobody's gonna care about some rusty pipe in the ground. I'll pull it out, set it aside if you're that worried." And that's when the tone changed, just slightly, enough that we both felt it. "You don't set it aside," I said, a little firmer now, You don't touch it at all. He looked at me for a second, smile still there but tighter now, less friendly. All right, he said, we'll see. That should have been the end of it. Or at least, that's what I told myself walking back to the house, that I'd made it clear that any reasonable person would leave it alone after that. But here's the thing about people who flip houses for a living. They see everything as a problem to solve or something to improve, and anything that doesn't fit the picture in their head gets labeled as clutter. And that little marker, to him, it was clutter. 3 days later, I came home from work, pulled into my driveway, and before I even got out of the truck, I knew something was off. The way the light hit that back corner, the way the space looked just a little too clean. I walked around the side of the house, heart picking up now, not racing, just heavier, like each step mattered more than the last. And when I got to the fence and looked over, the marker was gone. In its place was a freshly poured slab of concrete, still pale and damp-looking, with wooden framing set up around it, the beginning of a gazebo, exactly where he said it would be. For a second, I just stood there, staring at it, letting it sink in not because I didn't understand what had happened, but because I did, completely. Then I saw it. Off to the side, near his dumpster, half buried under scraps of wood and broken tile, the brass cap, dulled with dirt, and that rusted pipe, tossed like it didn't matter at all. And that's when something inside me went very, very quiet. Not angry, not yelling, just quiet in that way where you stop reacting and start deciding. I didn't call out to him. I didn't knock on his door. I didn't give him another warning. I just turned around, walked back into my house, and reached for my phone. I sat down at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand, staring at that contact list for a second longer than I probably needed to, not because I didn't know who to call, but because I understood exactly what would happen once I did. And there's a difference between being right and deciding to prove it. I pulled up the number for the National Geodetic Survey, took a breath, and hit dial. The woman who answered sounded calm, professional, the kind of voice that deals with very specific problems most people don't even know exist. And when she asked how she could help, I kept it simple. Hi, I said. I believe a federal survey marker has been removed and discarded. I have photos. There was a pause on the line. Not confusion, not hesitation, just a shift in tone, like I'd said the one sentence that moved this from routine to serious. Can you describe the marker? She asked. Concrete post, brass cap, iron pipe, boundary corner. I gave her everything I could remember, everything my dad had ever pointed out to me, and then I told her where it was, or where it used to be. She asked me to email the photos. So I did, one of the empty spot where the marker had been, the fresh slab sitting right over it, and one of the marker itself, lying in that dumpster like scrap metal. I hit send, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time since I got home, I let myself feel it, that mix of disbelief and something sharper underneath, not quite anger, more like, you had one job. Just leave it alone. About an hour later, my phone rang. Same number. Sir, she said, and now there was no softness in her voice. That appears to be a first-order control point. I didn't say anything at first, just let her continue. These markers are part of a national reference system. They are protected under federal law. Removal or destruction is a violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 1858. There it was, the line I'd been expecting, the one that turns a bad decision into a very expensive one. What happens next? I asked. We're coordinating with the state surveyor's office, she said. Someone will be out to assess the site. She didn't say when she didn't need to. The way she said it told me everything. Soon. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was worried. I wasn't. Not really, but because my mind kept replaying that moment at the fence, the way Kyle had laughed, the way he waved it off like it didn't matter, and I kept thinking about how many problems in life start exactly like that, with someone deciding the rules don't apply to them. The next morning was quiet, almost too quiet. No trucks, no saws, no workers. Then, around mid-morning, 2 white vehicles pulled up in front of Kyle's house. Not company trucks, government vehicles. You can tell the difference right away. There's a certain lack of branding, a kind of plain authority to them, like they don't need to advertise who they are. 2 men and a woman stepped out, all in field gear, carrying equipment cases that looked expensive in that understated way. Not flashy, just precise. I watched from my window for a second, then stepped outside like I was just going about my day, not wanting to make a scene, even though, in a way, the scene had already started. Kyle came out a minute later, probably thinking this was just another inspection or permit check. He still had that same confidence in his walk, that same half-smile. "Morning," he said to them, casual as ever. The woman, the same one I'd spoken to on the phone, stepped forward slightly. "Are you the property owner?" "Yeah," he said. "What's this about?" She didn't raise her voice, didn't change her expression, just held up a printed photo. "This marker," she said, "was located at the boundary of your property. Can you explain its current condition?" Kyle glanced at the photo, then over toward the backyard, then back at her. And for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something crack in that expression. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. "Oh, that thing," he said, trying to laugh it off. "Yeah, it was just some old pipe. I moved it out of the way. I've got it right over." "You removed a federally protected survey monument," she said, cutting him off, still calm. But now there was weight behind every word, and constructed over its original position. Silence. Not awkward silence, heavy silence. "I didn't know," Kyle said, a little too quickly. "Nobody told me it was that serious." And I almost said something right then. Almost stepped in and reminded him of our conversation, the warning I gave him, but I didn't. Because this wasn't my conversation anymore. The second man, older, maybe late 50s, stepped forward and looked past Kyle toward the backyard. "We're going to need access to the site," he said. They walked back there together, and I followed at a distance, staying on my side of the fence, just close enough to hear, not close enough to be part of it. They stood where the marker used to be, or where it should have been, staring at that clean slab of concrete like it was an insult. "This is directly over the original point," the older man said. Kyle nodded, slower now. "Yeah, I poured that 2 days ago." The woman looked at him. "This structure is obstructing a federal survey easement," she said. "I mean, it's just a slab," Kyle replied, his voice tightening a bit. "We can work around it, right?" And that's when the third person, who hadn't spoken yet, finally did. "No," he said, flat and simple. They explained it to him then, not in a rushed way, not trying to scare him, just laying it out piece by piece like a math problem with only one answer. That marker wasn't just a point in the ground. It was tied into a network of measurements stretching across counties, maybe even states. Its exact position had been calculated with millimeter precision, and restoring it wasn't as simple as putting the pipe back where it looked right. They'd have to reestablish it using high-precision instruments, referencing other control points miles away, recalculating everything to make sure it aligned perfectly with the system, and they couldn't do any of that with a concrete slab sitting on top of it. Kyle ran a hand through his hair, pacing a little now. "So what are you saying?" he asked. The woman met his eyes. "I'm saying the obstruction needs to be removed immediately." He stopped pacing. "You mean tear it out?" "Yes." There was a long pause after that, the kind where reality settles in whether you like it or not. "I just spent 10 grand on this," he said, quieter now. "I understand," she replied. "But this is not optional." He shook his head, looking around like maybe there was someone else who could step in, someone with a different answer. "This is my property," he said, a little louder now. "You can't just—" "That marker," the older man interrupted, "is part of a federal system. Obstructing it is a criminal offense." And right on cue, like the timing had been planned, a sheriff's vehicle rolled up to the curb. Kyle saw it, and whatever argument he had left disappeared. The deputy walked over, calm, not aggressive, just present in that way that makes it clear things have moved past discussion. "We're here to make sure everything proceeds without issue," he said. And just like that, the situation shifted from negotiation to compliance. Kyle stood there for a moment, looking at the slab, then at the gazebo frame he'd started building, then back at the officials, and I could see it happening. That slow realization that this wasn't going away, that there wasn't a workaround, no shortcut, no clever fix. "All right," he said finally, voice flat. "What do I need to do?" The answer was simple. He had to tear it out. That same day, he rented a jackhammer by the afternoon, and I watched from my side of the fence as he stood there in work boots and gloves, breaking apart something he'd just built. Each crack of concrete echoing a little louder than the last, each piece coming up like a reminder that some things cost more than money when you get them wrong. The surveyors didn't leave. They stood there, observing, making notes, occasionally checking measurements, waiting for the space to be cleared so they could begin their work. And Kyle, the guy who smiled like he had everything under control, just kept hammering. But the worst part for him wasn't the noise or the effort or even the loss of that project. That was just the beginning. Because 2 days later, the bill showed up. 2 days later, a white envelope showed up in Kyle's mailbox. No logo splashed across the front. No bright warnings, just that plain, official look that somehow feels heavier than anything else, like whatever's inside doesn't need to shout. I didn't see him open it, not right away, but I saw him later that afternoon, standing in his driveway with that paper in his hand, reading it again and again, like maybe the numbers would change if he gave them enough chances. He didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't even look my way at first, just stood there, shoulders a little lower than they'd been a week ago, like something had finally settled on him. Eventually, he walked over. Not with that confident stride from before, slower now, measured, like every step had to be considered. "You called them," he said. It wasn't really a question. I leaned against the fence, took a second before answering, not because I didn't have one, but because I wanted to keep this exactly where it was calm. "I reported a removed marker," I said. He let out a short breath, something between a laugh and frustration. "Do you have any idea what this is?" he asked, holding up the paper. "I can guess," I said. $42,000, he said, and this time there was no hiding it. The disbelief, the anger, the weight of it all hitting at once. 42,000 to put a pipe back in the ground. I shook my head slightly. "It's not just a pipe," I said. And for a second, I thought he might snap back, argue, push it further, but instead, he just looked past me, out toward that corner where the slab used to be, now broken up and cleared, the dirt exposed again like nothing had ever been built there. "They said they had to remeasure everything," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Bring in specialized equipment, tie it back into the network." I didn't even understand half of it. "Yeah," I said quietly. "That's kind of the point." There was a long pause after that. Not tense, not loud, just real. "You could have just talked to me," he said finally. And that one sat a little differently. Because technically, he wasn't wrong. We had talked, just not in the way he meant. "I did," I said, keeping my voice even, back at the fence. "I told you not to touch it." He looked at me then, really looked this time, like he was trying to line up that memory with everything that had happened since. "I thought you were exaggerating," he said. "I wasn't." Another pause. And then he nodded, just once, not agreeing, not apologizing, just acknowledging something he couldn't argue with anymore. Over the next week, things got complicated for him. The survey crew came back, not just the 3 from before, but a full team this time, trucks with mounted equipment, tripods, instruments I couldn't even name, all set up with a kind of precision that makes you realize you're watching something far more exact than it looks. They worked for hours, sometimes all day, taking readings, checking angles, referencing points that existed somewhere far beyond what you could see with the naked eye. And right in the middle of it all, they installed the new marker. Not the same as before. This one went deeper, a rod driven down into the ground, stabilized, measured, locked into place with a level of accuracy that felt almost excessive until you understood why it had to be that way. When they were done, they set the new brass cap on top, polished, clean, catching the sunlight in a way the old one never quite did. It looked permanent. Kyle watched most of it from a distance. Sometimes from his porch, sometimes from inside through the window. Always there, always aware, like he couldn't quite look away from the consequences unfolding in real time. A few days after that, I noticed a real estate sign go up in his yard. Didn't surprise me. $42,000 isn't the kind of bill you just shrug off. Even for someone used to flipping properties, especially when it comes out of nowhere, tied to a mistake you can't undo. But here's where things took another turn. About a week later, the sign was gone. Not sold, just gone. I ran into him again not long after that. This time at the edge of the driveway, both of us grabbing mail like neighbors do when life pretends to be normal. "Deal fell through," he said before I even asked. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why?" He gave a dry, humorless smile. "Can't transfer a clean title," he said. "Not with an active dispute tied to a boundary marker. Even though it's fixed now, it's still flagged in the system." I nodded slowly. "Makes sense. So what now?" I asked. He looked back at the house, then out toward the backyard, then finally at me. "Now I sit on it," he said. "Pay it off and wait." There was something different in his voice this time. Not defeated, not exactly, just grounded. Like whatever illusion he had about control, about being able to shape everything to fit his plan, had been replaced by something a little more real. Weeks passed. The construction stopped. The backyard stayed empty, except for that marker. And every now and then, usually in the late afternoon when the sun hits just right, that brass cap catches the light, bright enough that you can see it from his kitchen window. Yesterday, I walked out there with a cloth and wiped it down, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to. Just a small thing, polishing it until it gleamed a little more than usual. Petty? Maybe, but also symbolic. Because that little marker, the one that looked like junk, turned out to be the one thing on that entire property you absolutely couldn't ignore, couldn't replace, couldn't move without consequences. And I think that's what stuck with me the most through all of this, not the money, not the demolition, not even the involvement of the federal government, but the idea that some things are there for a reason, even if you don't understand them at first glance. Now here's the part I'm still not sure about. Did I do the right thing? I mean, I followed the law. I protected something that was meant to be protected, but I also knew exactly what would happen once I made that call. I knew it wasn't going to be a warning or a slap on the wrist. It was going to come down hard. And I made that call anyway. Some people would say that's justified. Others might say I could have handled it differently, pushed harder in that first conversation, tried to stop it before it got that far. Maybe they're right. Maybe not. All I know is, I gave him the information, and he made his choice. Same as I did. So I'm curious what you think. Was this just consequences catching up, or did I take it too far? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever had a neighbor situation that went sideways like this, I want to hear about it.